What if the Cold War never ended? The end of the Cold War was a shock to the human race. That a giant nation like Russia could fall apart in a matter of weeks is astounding. And so, this timeline is about what if Russia had never fallen apart and was able to hold together the Warsaw Pact. Before we can get this timeline, I need to explain why the USSR fell apart to show how this timeline could have happened. The main reason for the Soviet Union's collapse was the system was so inefficient and ineffectual. An example of this was that even in the peacetime, Russian factories would put out weapons because the system wasn't complicated and efficient enough to put out stuff that people would actually buy in the peacetime. And because the country was so poor, there would be no money to buy anything with. But to keep the jobs high, they had to produce something. So they produced weapons. This is why the US thought Russia looked so formidable, because all of their economy was going into the army. A second major example is that the people of Russia had lost faith in the Russian government. This was for a few reasons, but mainly because the Russian government was so terrible to its own people. One of the examples of this, and one of many, is that Stalin had the entire Cossack race moved from the Dnieper Valley in what is now the Ukraine to eastern Siberia for many years just because the Germans had been nice to them. If you Google Stalin, you'll find many other stories like this, and it'll take me a whole video to explain them all. And the third major reason is that Western ideas began to seep into the Soviet Union, showing the Soviet population really how bad their lives were by Western standards. The best way to explain how the Soviet powder keg exploded is by using an analogy. And this analogy is, imagine Gorbachev as a dam keeper, and as the Soviet Union as a dam with pressure building up on one side. Gorbachev realized the dam was about to blow, so he instituted reforms, in effect chipping away a little bit to relieve some of the pressure, while in the end, the dam just exploded, after some of the pressure had been relieved. The only way for this timeline to work is that hardline communists would have to evict Gorbachev from power and take power themselves, and thus prevent the reforms from taking place, and thus delaying the destruction of the Soviet Union. First and possibly last trouble of this Soviet Union of the 90s would be the internet. The internet's main strength is that it's easy to access with phones or computers, and just the sheer size and knowledge of it. For example, in the space that will take you to watch this video, 12 hours of footage will be put onto YouTube. Think about that. Imagine if you were a Soviet citizen who had just seen the internet. Imagine everything that's on the internet. That could do crippling things to the Soviet Union with all of the internet's Western ideas. On the deep web, Soviet rebels could easily join together and help each other. One of the great strengths of the Soviet Union was that without the idea movement there was in other countries, rebellions become small and localized. But in other countries, due to the movement of information, you could have giant, vast uprisings in large areas, and this would greatly weaken the USSR. For this reason, the Soviets would try to prevent the spread of technology, such as computers and phones, across the USSR and Warsaw Pact regions. As there could be no clear victor between the internet and the USSR, this timeline will briefly fork into two different timelines. The first of which, and the more unlikely, is that the USSR is able to successfully prevent mass internet usership within the USSR, and the second of which, and the more likely, is in which the internet tears Russia apart. If the Soviet Union was to survive the internet, it would have to deal with the jihadist movements. This is as the jihadist movements would dislike the Soviet Union, as most of the jihadist movements got their start by fighting against the Russians in Afghanistan, so most of the jihadist leaders would dislike the Russians personally. Also, Russia was an atheist country. Well, America is mainly a Christian country, and in the Quran, Christians and Jews are better than non-Christian Jews or Muslims or peoples of the book, and so, religiously, the Russians would be worse off in the eyes of the jihadi movement. For example, in this timeline, a major Russian site, like the Hermitage, would be attacked instead of the Twin Towers. This would mean that Russian armies would get involved in long protracted Middle Eastern wars in countries such as Afghanistan and possibly Iraq or Iran, similar to the US. Ironically, the US, to prevent the communists from seizing control of the Middle East, would likely arm these jihadist groups to fight against the Russians, similarly to the Russo-Afghan War of our timeline. As the Soviet Union would have had to have gotten rid of technology to survive, that would mean that they would fall behind the US by a great margin over time, and so in the end it would mean that the Russians would only survive for a short period of time, and in the end the Soviet Union would fall at a later date. The second of these timelines would be much more like our timeline. In the second of these timelines, ideas from the West would flood into Russia, thus showing the Russians how crappy their lives were, and, as I explained earlier, rebellions would be organized in the deep web, so there would be mass revolts across Russia, similarly to our timeline, and the Soviet Union would fall apart in the 90s or early 2000s. And besides that, it would be almost exactly the same to our timeline. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment and subscribe. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching.